Welcome to Season 6 of Far Reach Voyages, where we share our love of offshore sailing and adventure travel. For me, there's nothing like varnished cockpit coamings, especially on a fiberglass boat. Whether entering the cockpit from the deck or from the companionway, the cockpit's usually the first thing you see. Varnished coamings create a timeless and inviting environment. So for me, it's worth the effort to install them and maintain them. During the third voyage to the Virgin Islands, I noticed water dripping past caulk between the coaming and the fiberglass cockpit molding they were attached to. The water ran across the bridge deck when the Far Reach was heeling under sail, and more than once I got a wet butt sitting in my favorite spot. Though I had built and installed the coamings during the 6-year rebuild completed in 2015, it turned out there were some quality control issues with the 3M 4000 UV caulking I'd used. The failure of the caulking has since been widely reported. Sometimes the caulk seems to just break down and turn to a liquid, which appeared to be the case of missing caulk. 3M now claims the issue has been corrected. When we returned home in the summer of 2022, we hauled the boat out and began a project to replace the coamings. This video documents the building of the new coamings and serves to provide insight to others who are contemplating a similar project. The bottom line is, with a good plan, basic woodworking knowledge, and a strong dose of determination, you can design, build, and install quality coamings that will transform your cockpit from something dreary to one that puts a smile on your face every time you see it. In addition to replacing the coamings, we also rebuilt 2 of the Teak winch bases, which I'll describe in a follow-on video. So let's get started. The first order of business was to remove the coamings. Since they were only 8 years old and in excellent shape, I thought I could remove them and then modify them with some new ideas I had for improving them. But the 3M 4000 UV caulk I used as the bedding compound was aggressively attached. I used wood wedges, which has worked well for me in the past, but ultimately I needed to resort to an oscillating multi-tool to cut through the caulking. Though I was careful and patient, I damaged the wood removing them. The lesson here is to be cautious about using bedding compounds with stronger adhesive characteristics than necessary. If you own your own boat long enough, eventually most things need to be removed at some point. I took the coamings home and examined them and decided the work it would take to repair the wood, though feasible, was far more extensive than just building new ones. Plus, starting new made some of the mods I wanted to include easier than retrofitting the existing coamings. So I purchased 2 10-foot long by 15-inch wide, 5/4, also known as 1 1/4 thick, African mahogany planks from my friends at World Timber Imports, which is near my home. The cost of the wood was about $170 total. We need to replace the coamings on the Far Reach. So this is about a 10-foot long plank of African mahogany. It's about 15 inches wide. We need to have a straight edge on it so that we can rip it down to the right width on the table saw. Rough cut lumber doesn't come with a jointed edge. If you see it, see it's curved. So I snapped a chalk line on it. I'm going to hand plane it down to the chalk line, and then I'm going to run it over my smaller jointer, which you can see has very small in-feed and out-feed table. Now you can see that it's not perfectly flat, but it's a lot flatter than it was, and now I should be able to run this over my short in-feed, out-feed table joiner. That's how much sawdust we made. I emptied that before I started planing these boards. And you can see our boards now are nice and planed. They're a uniform 7/8 inch thick. With the African mahogany planks milled, I used the old coamings as a template for the new coamings, except I decided to make the coamings about 1.5 inches taller on the aft end. With the shape traced onto the mahogany, I used a Bosch jigsaw to cut the pattern. I ran the freshly cut planks over the joiner along the newly cut edge to ensure it was flat and square. Then I took the newly cut coamings along with the winch pads that I had built to the boat and test fit the parts to ensure my calculations were correct. They fit in there pretty well, and I made them 1 inch taller in the back. They're still just run wild. The new winch bases fit pretty good. And I need to work on the returns. I removed the bare teak cap rails from the old coamings so that I could reuse them on the new coamings. This is a good time to describe the purpose of the bare teak cap, which covers the entire top edge of the varnished mahogany coaming. Most wood coamings are rounded on top and varnished along with the rest of the coaming. The challenge with this approach is the varnish on the top edge of the coamings vulnerable to damage. Coamings are in a high traffic area. All kinds of things get dragged over them. Salt encrusted lines, gear, bags, toolboxes, supplies, and of course the crew steps on them. The top horizontal surface of the coaming is also receiving damaging vertical UV from the sun. It's the first area of the coaming to suffer damage to the varnish. When the varnish gets a break in it, generally the only solution is to strip all of it back to bare wood and start again with many coats of varnish. However, a bare teak cap rail protects the vulnerable top edge. Teak is tough and highly rot resistant. The teak cap serves as a barrier to all the everyday rough handling. Made to stand a little proud of the sides of the coaming, it serves as a wonderful cut edge, so there's no need for taping when varnishing. The teak takes the overhead vertical UV from the sun, leaving only vertical surfaces to be varnished. And these are low angle to the sun's harmful rays, so the varnish lasts longer. I also think it looks great. Let me say one more thing about the cap rails. Because the caps do such a good job of protecting the top of the coaming, it's easier to care for the varnish. And because it's easier, the varnished coamings add to the enjoyment of your boat instead of aggravating you like coamings that either have to be treated like a princess or look like they came off a workboat. The next step was to cut the ogee on the aft end of the coaming. I made a simple pattern out of 1/4-inch plywood and traced an ogee shape on the aft end of each coaming. Using the same pattern on each coaming ensured they would be identical. I carefully made the cut with a Bosch jigsaw and spent time with cabinet maker's files and sandpaper to smooth them flush and square. Previously, the ogee part of the coaming was not covered with teak. It was left exposed but varnished. Jib sheets sometimes got trapped there during the tack if I was not attentive, and it rubbed the varnish off. I thought it would be a nice finished look and provide additional protection to the varnish if I could figure out how to cover it with bare teak and tie it into the cap rail. I traced the shape of the ogee onto a piece of 1 1/8-inch thick teak and used a friend's bandsaw to carefully cut along the lines. Using pattern making files and sandpaper, I was able to get a very close fit between the curved teak cap and the ogee shape on the aft end of the coaming. To make the fit as precise as possible, I covered the coaming edge with packing tape, smeared on thickened epoxy, and clamped the ogee cap in place. The packing tape kept the epoxy from sticking to the coaming. When it was cured, it just needed to be cleaned up with a file and the fit was excellent. To avoid burning the wood or creating tear-outs, I sharpened the router bits, which have seen a lot of use. Router bits can be a challenge to sharpen, and I don't have the nice but expensive diamond cards often recommended. I just use a simple field expedient technique I've learned over the years. Whatever technique you use, it's important to keep all your edge tools sharp so they cut easily and cleanly. The other modification I wanted to make to the coamings was to the return block on the front end of the coaming. I didn't like the original Cape Dory design with a large recess at the rear of the cabin top one bit. It's time-consuming to tape and difficult to varnish, and if it's difficult, you'll make excuses and put it off because it's a hassle, and you simply can't delay exterior varnish. I thought about how to make this modification for several years. I cut the new return blocks and test fit them with the coamings on the boat. Satisfied, I cut shallow recesses in the coaming and in the return block and installed 2 1/8-inch thick bronze plates I fabricated with the jigsaw and files. Satisfied with the fit, I glued the return blocks to the coamings with Aerodux 185, which is a modern version of Resorcinol glue and is waterproof, steam-proof, boil-proof, and heat-proof. With the return blocks glued with Resorcinol, I installed fasteners and wood plugs, and then I rounded over the edge. Though the mahogany would be varnished, the bronze would be left natural to develop a lovely patina and would look great against the varnished mahogany and bare teak cap. Best of all, I'd never have to varnish in there again. Next, I used a laminate router to cut a 1/2-inch roundover on what would be the bottom inboard corner of the coaming once it's installed. I also cut a caulking groove in the coaming to ensure there would be bedding in place when the coamings were secured in place to prevent water from running between the coaming and the fiberglass. One of the challenges of using mahogany when strength is required is it's not as dense as teak or ash. Because the coamings have to be pulled under tension with bolts into a curved cockpit recess, flathead fasteners can be forced deeper than desired into the wood. If you over-tighten them, you can literally pull them right through the wood. To avoid that possibility, I decided to use panhead fasteners, which are flat underneath, instead of the wedge shape on flathead fasteners. I used a Forstner bit to countersink holes, then partially filled them with epoxy. After it cured, I drilled through them. I felt this would help the wood resist the pressure of the fasteners, tightened to pull the coaming snug to the curved cockpit. The wood's plenty deep enough to have room for a wood plug above the fastener, as you'll see. This is the side of the coaming that will face up to the fiberglass cockpit molding. You can see the caulking groove I cut with a core box router bit. The groove fits slightly below the deck and ensures there will be room for a layer of caulking, in this case butyl rubber, which can't get forced away under pressure and leave gaps. Though the sheet winches are self-tailing, I've always had a cleat for every winch. My winch cleats are Teak I made back in 2015. It only takes about an hour to make them, and they'll last many years with minimal maintenance. Previously, I secured the Teak cleats with wood screws run through the bronze backing plates installed on the inboard side of the coaming into the cleats installed on the outboard side of the coaming. The backing plates worked okay, but they were time-consuming to varnish around. I decided instead to embed bronze nuts in the outboard side of the coaming and use a 1/4 bronze machine screws to secure the bare Teak cleats to the coaming. I bed the wood cleats with dolphinite, which makes removing them easy when it's time to varnish the coaming. I don't use these cleats under huge loads. They're used as backup for the self-tailers. The load's in shear, so there's little chance of them tearing the nuts out of the wood. It was finally time to apply 3 coats of varnish to protect the coamings during installation. I use the same varnish I use for all my varnish projects, Epiphanis Clear Gloss. I've used gallons of it, and though I'm no expert varnisher, I'm familiar with it and I'm confident using it. Installing the coamings wasn't difficult. I used 2x4s and padded blocks to wedge the coamings into position. I drilled all the holes, installing bolts as I went, then removed the coamings and chamfered the holes in the fiberglass so bedding compound would be forced into the holes when I tightened the nuts. Then I reinstalled the coamings and bedded them in the threaded bolts with a thin strip of butyl rubber and mahogany colored polysulfide. I make my own wood plugs from a small hand-me-down benchtop drill press. I've cut thousands over the years. Orienting the grain horizontally makes trimming them easier. Insert whatever end of the plug gives you the best fit. Typically I insert the tapered end if the hole's deep enough. If the hole's shallow, then I insert the other end. Orient the grain of the plug to the grain of the surrounding wood best you can. I use Titebond 3 glue for wood plugs. And I make these pads out of plywood, 1/2-inch plywood with a rubber block I put on myself, so I have a hard side and a soft side. You start off with the hard side, just getting it down kind of flush. You can tell when it's flush because there won't be a varnished ring around it. It'll be smoothly sanded all around. Sand the grain. There we go. And then I like to finish it off with putting on the rubber blocks. Right? Aerodux 185 is a resorcinol based adhesive. You can use it in temperatures a little colder than normal straight resorcinol, and it also has a little bit of gap filling capabilities that your normal 70-degree temperature resorcinol doesn't have. But it's got all the other benefits. It's waterproof, heatproof, boil-proof, steam-proof. See it tearing off lower on one end, so come back the other direction and you can figure out which is going to give you the cleanest cut. Because if it tears off below the surface, you got to drill it out and put another one in. Join us in the next episode of Far Reach Voyages, when I share how I built winch bases with an interesting and useful modification unique to the Far Reach. If you enjoyed this episode of Far Reach Voyages, let us know in the comments. Also, consider liking and subscribing, as it tells us you would like to see more videos and it helps the channel grow. See you in the next episode.